Pathikada Bandula Jayasekara Samaga.
Welcome to Pathikada. Now we must tell you how to live with leopards or wildcats. So I've got two guests, husband and wife, Dr. Andru Kittle and Anjalee Wotson. Anjalee is a zoologist and Andru is a ecologist, and you say principal researcher and managing trustee of the Wilderness and Wildlife Conservation Trust. Now let's start with you, Anjalee. Now you won the Green Oscars. Let's talk about that first. I think our viewers should know about what is this. They call Whitney Award.
That's right.
And what is a Green Oscar?
Okay, firstly I just want to say that he's a zoologist and the ecologist. That's fine.
So, yeah.
So, the Whitney Award is basically given out by an organization, a group called the Whitney Fund for Nature, and it's really one man's vision who 25 years ago at the birth of his daughter decided he needed to do something for wildlife. And so he put together this fund, and what it is it's they search for people around the world internationally that are doing work on the ground, conservation work, wildlife related conservation work. You put in, it's like a regular grant, but the thing with it is that it's got a high profiling and it's continuation funding, so they stay with you as a partner for a long term, which is not easy, because when you do conservation work you need long-term commitment, because it takes a long time to actually put in place certain measures. So the Whitney Fund for Nature does this, and the reason they call it the Green Oscars is because it's very high profile. So Princess Anne hands out the award, for example, and there's a big event, and the people who contribute towards this are pretty much high profile.
So the world recognized what you both of you have been doing silently.
That's
they gave
right.
the award to you, not to Andru.
Because I don't know, maybe I'm the prettier face.
See, you have been working with leopards, and there is, we talk of the elephant-human conflict, but we have seen even on our news bulletins, especially the leopards are moving around in the hills. So let's start from there. Now here you have put out a brochure. I'll show this brochure. Living with wildcats. How do people live with wildcats?
So interestingly enough, in Sri Lanka, I think people have lived with wildlife and wildcats for centuries. I think now many people sort of in the newer generation are forgetting that, or as the habitat gets cut up and there is new housing and there's a change going on in society, as it were, people have sort of forgotten how to live with wildlife in certain areas. So it's a matter of just making people remember and realize the importance of living in coexistence with wildlife, and that we have for centuries, which is why Sri Lanka is such a high biodiverse island, and that we have so much wildlife here, even though we have 21 million people in such a small country. So that's really is the key, coexistence and living closely with wildlife, and how to go about doing that. So those are the messages that really we need to get out to everyone, to remember again what our ancestors knew.
How did you get involved? How did you start to organize the conservation process?
So we've been doing work internationally, mostly volunteering with different conservation-based organizations, a lot with primates actually. And of course Anjalee was born and grew up here, so always had a love for Sri Lanka and for Sri Lankan wildlife. I'd never been until I met her, needless to say. So when we came back here, we actually realized this was about, in 2000 is when we started this work essentially. And at that time, everything in Sri Lanka was focused on elephant conservation and management, which of course is hugely important. But there was a real gulf in terms of the knowledge about the leopard, which is the island's top predator. And so we kind of recognized that there was that gulf, and we started a project in Yala at the time to try and get some information, some baseline information we started with about where these animals are found, some of the habits, the ecology, how the species lives in its habitat. So that's where things started, and then it typically snowballs from there. The more you learn about anything, the more you realize you have to know. And so it led us from one place to the next, and 18 years later we realized we're still doing the same kind of work, trying to find out as much as we can about the Sri Lankan leopard for long-term conservation and management.
And Anjalee, let's talk about, I'm sure lots of our viewers are not aware now, you have come out with this little brochure. Let me first show it. This is Wildcats of Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka ve Balal Paula. there's, so lots of people are aware of, I'm learning from this, and I hope you leave the brochure with me. So if you could tell our viewers about this, the Wildcats of Sri Lanka, and take us through.
Okay, so the reason we actually came up with something like this was because when we were working throughout the country, we realized that many people who actually live out there within, within forested areas, didn't quite know what they were seeing. So when they saw an animal, they didn't quite know what it was. Often we were told it's a baby leopard. It was always a kotia, petao madam, like that. So I said, okay, fine, I think there's going to be some issue here. So we decided to do something like this where you can show people, what is it? What are you seeing? Are you seeing this animal, or that animal? Sometimes people do know, but very often they don't. So then when they know what it is, and when they know the sizes of the animal, when they know, for example, they've seen a fishing cat that's, the size of a big dog, Handun Divya. They will always tell you Divi Patia. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's a fishing cat. No need to. It's not an issue. This is what it is. Then there's rusty spotted cat, which is actually the smallest cat in the world.
What do you call that?
And then there is the Balal Divya, which is the jungle cat.
Yes.
So we have 4 cats here in Sri Lanka: the leopard, the kotia or the divya, which is the largest and is spotted. We've got the Handun Divya, which is the fishing cat. We've got the Balal Divya, which is the jungle cat, and then the smallest. That's right. So there's multiple names for that also, which is again an interesting thing. Names, nomenclature is always an issue here when it comes to cats. So it's always good to have the visual to show people. And then the rusty spotted cat, which is the smallest cat.
That is Kola Divya or Balal Divya.
That's right. It's always good for people to know what they're seeing. That way you can explain things to them. You can tell them the nature of the beast. You can reduce fears. Where sometimes, often, fear comes from the unknown because they don't know what they're seeing. They don't know what to expect from these animals. So once you can, reduce that fear by giving them knowledge, you've already sort of, come a long way in conservation and living in coexistence.
So, and do you think now, people get really scared, but they're more worried about the leopard, which is.
Yeah, of course. The leopard obviously is the largest of the cats. So there is a fear, and that fear, like Anjalee was saying, typically comes from not really knowing. One of the amazing things here in Sri Lanka, of course, is that you've got, like Anjalee mentioned a minute ago, 20, 21, 22 million people, 65,000 square kilometers. You've got hundreds of leopards. You've got thousands of elephants. All sharing space, very limited space. So in terms of leopard, we're seeing actually the animal themselves is doing a lot towards fostering coexistence. Up in the hills where we work, for instance, what we see is that the animals are using the area only at night. So in the daytime, people are using the landscape. At night, the leopard is coming and using the landscape. They're just naturally kind of segregating. Temporal niche partitioning in the scientific term. Just
so you mean to
separating
say that
by time.
Leopards are more wiser than human beings.
Exactly.
Well, the last thing they want is to encounter people. That's one of the other, important elements, is that the leopards are typically scared of people. And most of the time, you won't see one, and part of the reason you won't see one is if they hear you or sense you, they will move away. So one of the main parts of this Living with Wildcats pamphlet, for instance, is just the simple notion of making a bit of noise when you're going to an area, forest area, whatever. If you just give a heads up to that animal will move away and you won't know it was even there.
So that's important. So we should give a signal and say that we are moving. Even for an elephant, I think that
exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So
we're moving through the forest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The only time that issues ever come up here in Sri Lanka is when an animal might get surprised. That seems to be the only times. Up in the tea estate, sometimes that happens, but very rarely. And when given the number of animals that are there and the number of people moving around the landscape, it's actually pretty low level of negative interaction.
But now, see, I'm seeing. It's very sad. I know you don't like to talk about Yala, but it's terrible. Okay, in the name of tourism, they are destroying our leopards. Now, what's happening? Destroying the leopards, the dolphins and the whales. In Mirissa and Trincomalee, and the elephants. Why can't we live together? You understand, but if you can tell you all are the authorities on this to the viewers, because so we might lose this in the name of tourism.
Yes, 100%. And I think, we've been talking about educating people and, explaining to them what the different cats are and people that live close by with wildlife. But I think it's also a matter of educating the general public that are the tourists. We have a lot of local tourism now, post-war. There's a lot of travel within the country. And so this has obviously increased people going in to national parks and many areas to take a look and see, which they haven't been able to do for so many years. So it's a matter of educating them also, making them realize and value what we have and how to go about viewing wildlife, as it were. But on the other hand, I think this is a problem that's worldwide. It's something the tourism industry could also come forward with and, decide on how they're going to move forward with it. Obviously, authorities also need to do it. People who are involved and invested in tourism at the ground level as well need to do it. And I think more than anything, the tourists themselves, be they local or foreign, really need to make that decision that, all right, now is enough and we need to be much more responsible.
Have you got any ideas, a plan to discuss with the tourism authorities? Because I think they look at just the money, but people like you all just want to protect this.
Yeah. So it's that classic case of killing the goose that lays the golden egg. I mean, and obviously the tourism departments won't want to do that. So long term, it has to be sustainable for this to work. Otherwise you get your profits in now, and then in the long term you have nothing. So I think everyone's kind of becoming more and more aware of it. It's a question of what you do about it, and so that's what Anjalee was trying to get at. There are some avenues that could be taken. For instance, in Yala, now some of the other blocks are being opened up. I think that's actually important. Try and get some of the traffic that is concentrating down in the heavily used block to some of the other ones. This goes for some of the other national parks as well. Sri Lanka's got a lot of national parks that get very little visitation, like Galoya National Park, Madroya National Park, Waskamo even. Lots of them. And some of those would actually benefit from an increase in visitation, as long as it's limited. We can't start, replicating what's happening in Yala and other places.
Yes,
I'm by no means advocating
Yala
that.
Across the country.
But if we can spread the cluster that's only going to Yala out a little bit more, I think that would be something that would be helpful, because some of the other parks actually would benefit from having a presence of people within, which would stop the potential for illicit activities within those parks because there's no oversight. And the wildlife department is doing what they can, but they're also stretched. They
are understaffed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So they work very hard, but they're in some places it's very difficult. These are large areas and limited networks of roads and ability to stop people coming in. So
there is a plan. It's a matter of implementing it, and it's going to take a little time, but implementing it right, and it's doable. Other countries, for example, I think it's always used an example, South Africa and their parking system, where they limit. When you go in, the vehicle is limited. There's certain rules and regulations that you have to abide by, and because you're going into the system that's already set up very rigorously as a tourist, most people will follow through.
But there are traffic blocks in Yala. There are traffic blocks in many areas. I do like to go to these places.
Yes, it's true. When we were working there, 15 years ago, it wasn't like this at all, People in fact told us, why are you working with leopards here? You should be in Vilpattu or you should be somewhere else. So it's just a matter of the fact that the wildlife population is much more habituated there. So the news is out that that's where you want to go to see wildlife. Hopefully, I think it's become such a negative scenario now that it has to change for the better.
Now you see, the world over they talk about the Sri Lankan leopards. I've seen several articles, but by this, the way the guides are behaving, the way some of these people will destroy them, maybe we might lose our leopards.
Yeah, it's definitely a balance that you have to try and come to. I think at this point, the leopards themselves in Block 1, for instance, we don't know the stress that might be being caused. They're luckily, they can move away. And so I don't know how much they're fully being disturbed. There are obviously instances, there's road deaths, which is just, unforgivable within national parks.
Yes,
really.
accidents where leopards are killed. just by being knocked down.
So that's something we don't really understand, is the effect it's having on the actual leopard population, whether it's interrupting hunting and movement patterns and those kind of things. We don't know enough about that. But just from even the perspective of visitors going, I mean, we know that the feedback from international visitors for sure is pretty negative overall. I mean, people go, they like to see the animals, but they come back with a remembrance of kind of the number of vehicles and the crowds and the pack, and so not really willing to go back. And so those things will come back to the country when when tourism numbers maybe perhaps start dropping in some of these areas.
That's the tragedy of Yala. We'll go for a short break and we'll come back with you in a moment.
Pathikada Bandula Jayasekara Samaga Bandula Jayasekara Samaga.
Welcome back to Pathikada. Now, Anjalee, you have worked in Agrapatha, Kandy, Galloya, Ritigala, hotel places. I'm sure viewers would want to know more about it.
So the reason why we have worked throughout the island is because in Sri Lanka, our leopard is the top predator, and it holds a very key, important role in its influence throughout entire systems. So we want to understand how the leopard, by understanding the leopard I should say, we could contribute towards a general conservation of just not our wildlife but habitats as well in Sri Lanka. So for example, our work up in the hill countries right now, where we're focusing in sort of the watershed area for the country around Muskelia, Castlereagh, where all our reservoirs are. And what we're finding is that leopards themselves are choosing certain refuges, and they're often the ridgelines. And these ridgelines are also the watershed forests for our reservoirs. So it's a double role here. By understanding the leopard, where they're moving and how they're living, and then protecting that area and that landscape, you're also protecting the waters, where all our three major rivers start in these areas up in the hills, in the Central Highlands. So it plays this double role of using the leopard as a flagship, really is the term that's used, for conservation in general, and where this conservation also is protecting the water that we get on this island, which is essential because we're an island and we need to have our fresh water. So that's the reason why we've been working throughout. So for example, in Galloya right now we're starting work. Again, not much has been done there for many, many years. It's a large swath of forest, monsoon evergreen forest that's there. Again, there's Senanayaka Samudra. It's again a water area. In Sri Lanka, everywhere you look, there's water. There's a vava, there's it's very important in that sense. So understanding how forest connectivity, and our top predator, the leopard, is using these forests is really what we're trying to do here. And then use that for the larger conservation goal for Sri Lanka.
But people don't understand that enough. So that's what you all are trying to educate.
Exactly.
You are using Sinhala, Tamil,
yes.
all three languages.
Exactly. Trilingual, because obviously throughout the country, communities are, they speak all three languages, Sinhalese and Tamil, very important for them to understand where they are, what the issues are, if is it an issue or not, why we need to protect our forests, for example. We're also looking beyond just what we see as pure forest or virgin forest, and we're realizing here in Sri Lanka that our habitats have been altered through the centuries, and that wildlife and leopards are using mixed habitats. So they are using secondary forest, renewed chaina, plantation lands. Of course, there needs to be good forest also. So this idea of moving beyond just protected areas that are pure forest, but into mixed landscapes that can have mixed protection, where people also can move in and use the forest, because at the end of the day, if people living close to a forest don't value the forest or don't get anything from the forest, why are they going to want the forest?
But Anjalee, you said, this is what's worrying our people. You said plantation land. So there were incidents, I think, which we also reported. That's worrying our people. How do they get about it? They try to, remember, they had to keep a dog, get the leopard out. So they are worried.
Yeah, that's true. People are worried, and so fear.
Scared,
fear is one of the major things. So addressing that, and that's what we try to do with these awareness programs, which we try to run, which is basically educational purposes. Get people more aware of the leopard itself, the way that it acts, the fact that it's really, It's not an animal that's seeking out encounters with people at all. It's in fact trying the opposite, to avoid that. And so the things that you can try to do to avoid that. However, the problem is that it's fear. So one incident and it gets sparked, and then people who have been living in an area for a long time with no issue, suddenly that same area becomes a fearful place for them.
Is it the same with the tiger, Anjali? Tiger would try to attack, right? Unlike the leopard, or how is it?
No, I mean, all big cats would not want to come in contact with humans usually. The leopard even more so because it's solitary and it's a very retreating animal in a sense. It's not interested in coming in contact with humans. Like Andrew was saying, reducing the fear, I think media has a big role to play here, and I'm glad we're talking here like this, to not only show the negative stories, to not only say, oh, leopard attack, even though it wasn't a leopard attack, it just happened to be they came across a planter and so it turned around and wanted to run away, and so it was just a defense mechanism for it to go. So that's the key role, to make people realize that don't be afraid, because there isn't a reason to be afraid. Be smart. Don't go out at night, because that's where the wildlife are. If you are going out at night, then be aware. So it's interesting, we were doing this program with the tea planters in Talawakale at TRI the other day, and one of the things they talked about is how in the past decade, in the night time, how humans are now moving in the landscape up in the plantation land. Whereas a long time ago, or not even that long ago, at night people were all inside. Nobody moved about. But now with television and, trishaws and being able to move around the landscape, people are moving around at night. So then you're going to encounter wildlife. So then you have to be aware of that.
And I'll leave this, I think you should tell the viewers, because you say how to live with wildcats, I think very important.
I think a lot of people know this. They have maybe forgotten it, or definitely
let's remind them.
Yes. So, it's just a matter of ensuring that all the paths that you use through a forest is kept clear. So the paths that you use regularly. If villagers are going in and out of the forest, those areas need to be kept clear, the pathways, so that you can see what's coming. Because often with carnivores, it's the surprise that causes any incident with humans. So if the animal can see you and hear you coming, it's going to move away. That's a key thing. If you're gathering forest products, again, make noise, be in a group, let wildlife know you're in the area. Daytime activity is much better than nighttime activity. People don't need to be there at night. Usually if you're there in the night, you're doing something illegal. That's usually the case. Use lights, use fire torches. If you're
a fire torch, the big.
It's just a fire stick.
The fire, right?
Fire stick. I mean, often together with wildlife department, what we say is if there's a group of houses that are close to a forest area that leopards have been seen at, keep the area around you clear and put some fire torches. Right? The animal's not going to come. If so,
the pandam, what you're saying,
exactly, the pandams, the fire torches. Again, like I said, go in a group so that there's always someone else to keep a lookout if you're gathering forest products. If you're having cattle, we recommend obviously at night, goats, young calves, keep them protected, keep them in. Dogs, dogs again are smart, they will bark. So there is this belief that dogs attract leopards. What we're finding is that there's enough wild prey in Sri Lanka. Leopards are not just eating dogs like you have in India, for example, where, sometimes their sole food is that. So it's not a case that they're coming specially for dogs. Not at all. It just so happens that if dogs are roaming around at night, a leopard's going to eat it. It's an easy snack in that sense. So keep your animals close in that way. If you have guard dogs, it's a double scenario here. It will bark, so you'll know the leopard is there, but give your dog some protection too, because otherwise if it does get taken, that becomes a situation. Everyone says, Madam Ballarangya, Divya Villara Vela Gatta. So I'm like, okay, do you know that for a fact? If so, then next time try to, protect your animal in that sense.
Andru, now you all are doing a lot in Castlevale and Mouse. Can you tell our viewers what you all are doing there?
So again, that's an extension of the work that we've been doing for years. So we've been trying to get a handle on the island-wide distribution of the leopard, as well as sort of density estimates and different habitat types, because the different habitat types in Sri Lanka are very important. This is why we've worked in the arid zone, the dry zone, the montane zone. So this was some work that we were planning to do in the Peak Wilderness Sanctuary, which is sub-montane forest. But just before this happened in 2016, there was a spate of leopard deaths up in the Central Highlands, caught in snares mostly snares that are set for wild boar and deer, but obviously indiscriminate, so leopards get caught. So about 8 or 9 animals were killed in that area. So we decided to actually shift our focus from the protected area to the unprotected landscapes around between Castlereagh and Muskelia in the tea estate lands, which is this mosaic of plantations, village areas, obviously vast tea, and some riverine forests like that. So we did some remote camera work, which is what we do a lot. We use remote cameras to estimate the leopard presence, as well as density in different areas, as well as the prey availability. So we set these cameras up over over a 500 square kilometer area within this landscape, in 25 different tea estates. The tea estate network has been extremely supportive of this work, which has been fantastic. So very, very helpful. And we were very surprised actually to get a lot of information about leopards and leopard movement. I mean, the density of leopards in this unprotected landscape is pretty high, given. When I say that, I got to say that with a caveat. High meaning we have about 28 animals within a 500 square kilometer area compared to thousands of people. So it's not a lot of leopards, but from a leopard perspective in an unprotected area, it's interesting that they're there. So that's where, and part of, during the course of this work, we realized that there was a key habitat in this area, which is a ridge between Castlereagh and Muskelia, where the female leopards were residing. So they weren't just moving around on the tea lands. The males would move through the tea lands, mostly just crossing, it seemed, between other forest patches, whereas the females really weren't doing that. Even that, they were in the refuge areas up in the ridge area, where the prey is found and where there's a bit more forest. So that's kind of where the focus has become, in trying to figure out a way that we can move towards some level of protection for this area, which is obviously of key importance to the leopard population.
Anjalee, now my final question. Now politicians are destroying the forest, the nature, everything. You all are trying to protect it. Now how do people get involved? Because you have this leopard project. How do they support you? How can they work with you?
Okay, so to answer that first, I just want to say one thing, and this is on behalf of us and the Wildlife Department as well, is about translocation, because you mentioned politicians and pressure and from people. So often people call for moving the leopard or removing the leopard. That is not going to work, because the animal is such that they have territories, they have home ranges. If one is taken out, another will come in. And the other who comes in doesn't know the area, so it's going to cause even more issues possibly. And if you take this animal out, where are you going to put it? There's leopards pretty much throughout the island in that sense. So that is not an answer, and I think that is a key message for people to realize. Translocation is not going to work. How do people throughout the country help in this overall conservation? Well, already, as Andru mentioned, the tea estate sector have been extremely supportive.
Like how do people volunteer and work with you all?
So,
because I can see that you all are spending your money and giving.
Yes, and where we are working, we've got Dilma that's on board, that supported us. We've got volunteers that come through. So one of the things right now we're looking at, for example, where volunteers could come in locally through, be it organizations or groups, is snare removal, for example. There's something we need to do. We sent earlier, the Wildlife Department is strapped. They don't have that kind of personnel. So as civic society, this is something we can go forward and do. Make groups every few months. We comb the forested areas and the mixed landscapes here. Remove the snares, because that's really an issue right now when it comes to leopards. Call in any issues that are there. And awareness, always the key for, moving the message along.
Shall we end by giving the landline?
Sure. Or no, actually give the mobile.
Yeah, you can call the Wilderness and Wildlife Conservation Trust. The mobile number is 077 3544 382. Thank you very much, Anjalee.
Thank you for having us.